then there was another time, right? So like the guy underneath like the boss that I just said, he has a habit of just flying off the handle, like being like super emotional, like sometimes abusive, doesn't really have a good grasp of his emotions and people skills. And one time, I was doing something and according to him, I was doing it incorrectly, right? And he thought it would be a good idea to basically make an example out of me in front of the entire team of employees. And the way that he spoke was just super condescending, almost like he was trying to put on an act for someone so that they know that, he's in charge, Like really, really cringy stuff. However, yeah. It was a while ago. It was like a year and a half ago. And yeah, and I wasn't happy with that. I couldn't contain my I wasn't happy with that. And he does this thing where like if he starts to cuss someone out, right? It happens. He goes away and then he comes back like half an hour later and then he tries to like crack jokes and stuff with you. And in my mind, I'm just like, that's not how it works. No. Like, people, like, that is not how you confront, like issues, and confrontations, but in his mind, he thinks, like that stuff is okay, like cussing people out and like speaking to them in a really rude way, like that's okay. As long as you come back like half an hour, and say some stupid joke, and they laugh at it, and in their mind, there's like, like that didn't happen. That other stuff, that didn't happen. That is kind of how he views that type of stuff. And mate, it wasn't gonna fly. It wasn't gonna fly. So basically, like, at the time that he came back and he tried to crack a joke, because he does this every single time. So I knew what was going to happen. Like if he thinks that someone is upset with him, he'll always come back and try to crack a joke and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I can't remember exactly what I said, but I was just like, mate, I really wish that you would learn how to speak to people properly. Like, I started off with that, and he was like, "Oh, what? Oh, what? What do you mean? What do you mean?" And then I went into elaborated. And then we ended up having like a 10-minute conversation, about it. He was pretty receptive to it at that point in time. So after that interaction, I thought that things would improve, right? Like you start to set a boundary, like things, you teach people how to treat you. And I just taught him how to treat me in a respectful way. I wasn't rude. I just called him out. And again, if he wanted to get rid of me, he could have. At the time, I think I was still on a casual employment. However, again, like my actions, it actually does back up the words that I say. So it would not be in his best interest to get rid of me because I provide a lot of value. And I think that it kind of is why I'm able to call people out like that. If I was someone who was extremely lazy, like not very valuable to the company, like any excuse, they'd be like, oh yeah, just get rid of him. Yeah, bro, I would have absolutely made his day, like that was just two of the main instances. Like there has been so many more. And then there was another one, right? So like with the same guy that I just said, like how he didn't speak to me properly and I called him out on it. So about a year or so onwards, it happened a couple of months ago actually. So basically I was saying something on the two-way walkie-talkie, right? I was talking to someone else, and I didn't know that this boss was actually on site, because like you don't know who's on site until like you actually physically see him. And like I basically like said, oh yeah, just do this, blah blah blah, and it was correct to say that, because I'm at like a senior position, right? And I didn't know that this guy was on site, and he is obsessed with control, right? Anything that happens that doesn't have his stamp of approval, mate, you are gonna cop it. And I did, right? So like as I was speaking to someone else on the two-way, he like interrupted and just started shouting and was like, no, this is not happening, blah blah blah. Basically like undermining me like big time. And I was just like, okay, all right. So I let that simmer for about an hour, and then sure enough, he comes up and he's like tries to crack a joke again. And I basically said the same thing as I did like a year and a half ago. And I was just like, mate, like you did it again. Like, how come you can't speak to me properly? And it's not just me, right? Like he's like this with everyone. However, I'm the only one that has the balls to actually confront him and say, like, call him. Like, hey, like, stop, please. And this interaction, it was an interesting one. It was almost like I was his therapist. Yeah, he went through a wide range of emotions. At first, he was confused with what I was saying. So I elaborated and I said, like, look, if it was me, like, this is how I would have handled that situation in a professional and a not so rude way that doesn't make people feel like crap. And I basically explained like what it should have looked like. And he was like, oh, mate, like, I like to keep things as short and sweet. And in my mind, I was thinking, okay, it was short, but it certainly wasn't sweet because it was rude as hell. So yeah, at first he was confused. And then he remembered that I called him out like a year or so earlier. And then he started to get angry because I called him out again. And then after the anger, like he kind of, a bit of his trauma, it started to come to the surface, like, and he got like very emotional. He was very close to actually being in tears. So yeah, I have a habit of getting into, awkward situations. However, when you are on retention, these types of interactions, like, they won't be awkward for you. It doesn't faze you in the slightest. You're just like, okay, this is just another conversation. I have to tell this person how I actually feel. In a nice way. However, yeah, so yeah, I have a bit of a track record at this place where I have absolutely no fear, and I have no sense of hierarchy, if that makes sense. I just don't get this whole hierarchy structure. It's because I know like my own worth has become so high that I view this stuff as just people putting on masks to make themselves like feel, good, in order to feed their ego a bit. And yeah, it's interesting how like someone who is literally young enough to be, like a person's son, right, is basically teaching them how to properly speak to people. So yeah, it's something that I certainly wasn't able to do in the past. However, I feel like I'm a lot more open now and less anxious to actually express real and honest opinions. And that is something to be grateful for. It is, because like that's something that not many people actually have the balls to do in that type of situation. However, yeah, it takes a bit of self-awareness to actually not take it too far, though. That you start actually saying inappropriate things and stuff. All of those other times, like, it was just simply me just saying something respectfully, but at the same way, like, not beating around the bush, and not just sweeping it under the rug, and just letting it go, because I knew that if I start letting that stuff go, like, people like that, they will start to think that this can be a regular occurrence. And I don't want that for myself. I don't want that for myself, because on this journey of retention, you start to respect yourself on such a deep level, and that stuff, it just doesn't fly with you, because like you take that as disrespect, as it is, like you see it exactly as it is. However, someone else, like they may not view that as disrespect, because like that, if they have such a low level of self-esteem, like they'd probably think that, oh, hey, I probably deserved it, didn't I? No, I don't think anyone deserves that stuff, especially if you are someone that treats people in the same way that you would like to be treated just by default. And that is how I've always been. However, every now and then, always someone that like needs to be taught this stuff, because it is very important in your everyday interactions. So I'll leave it at that. Take care.